Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a room full of people who trust you, who admire the clarity you carry into every conversation, who sense something settled and unhurried at the center of you, and that this quality, this presence, is not something you performed, but something you survived into. Most people move through their lives with the uneasy feeling that they are slightly less than they appear, that beneath the composed surface, something unacknowledged is quietly running the show, shaping reactions before thought arrives. This feeling isn't merely a symptom of low self-esteem or unfinished work or the ordinary anxiety of being human, but it is the shadow of the psyche, the accumulated weight of everything you were taught to exile from yourself, pressing upward, asking to be known. What if the presence you have been seeking, that quality of depth and groundedness you recognize instantly in others, is only ever born on the far side of that reckoning? By the end of this journey, you will not only understand what woken-up presence actually feels like from the inside, how it moves, what it no longer needs. The final revelation is perhaps the most disquieting of all, the precise thing integration asks you to surrender. There is a part of you that was not destroyed in childhood. It was hidden. The shadow, as Jung understood it, is not the darkness that opposes your goodness. It is the fullness that outlasted your socialization. Every time the adults in your world communicated, through punishment or withdrawal or simple silence, that some part of you was unacceptable, that part did not disappear. It was stored. Jung wrote that the shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. This means the shadow is not a flaw you developed. It is the ancient, unedited version of yourself that your conscious identity learned to disown in order to belong. Think of it less as a monster beneath the floor and more as an archive. Everything you were told not to be, everything you stopped allowing yourself to feel, everything that made the people around you uncomfortable, all of it held intact, waiting, in the lower registers of the psyche. There is a moment, not dramatic, not announced, when the mirror tilts just slightly, and you see something in your own reflection that you cannot explain away. Maybe it arrives through a reaction that surprises you with its intensity, a flash of contempt toward someone whose confidence you claim to admire, a surge of satisfaction when a person you envied stumbled. Or perhaps it surfaces in a dream so vivid and so morally uncomfortable that waking from it feels less like relief than exposure. Jung observed that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, and this means the encounter is never merely intellectual. It arrives as a disturbance of identity, a crack in the image you had learned to inhabit. How often have you felt an emotion and then immediately moved to explain it away, to assign it a more acceptable name? And when you do, what exactly are you protecting? The unsettling truth is that recognition, however clarifying, is only the threshold, and what waits beyond it is something even recognition alone cannot prepare you for. And yet, what you have just glimpsed, that first uncomfortable recognition of the figure you have been carrying without knowing it, is only the outermost threshold of what the shadow holds, the visible edge of something far older and stranger beneath. Because recognition, however disorienting, raises a question that most people never think to ask. What if the darkness you have been fleeing contains not only the wounds you buried, but gifts you were never allowed to open? Energies and capacities that went underground not because they were dangerous, but because they were too alive for the world you were handed. The most vertiginous territory is still to come. Stay with us as we descend into how the shadow moves through your daily life and what it has been quietly keeping for you all along. There is a word Jung used to describe the destination toward which all of this difficult inner work is ultimately aimed, and that word is individuation. Not the improvement of the self, but the completion of it, the becoming of what you were always, in some nascent and buried form, already capable of being. What distinguishes individuation from ordinary self-development is that it does not move in a straight line toward a better version of you. It moves in a spiral, returning again and again to the same wounded material, but each time from a slightly higher vantage, each time with a little more of yourself present to meet it. Jung wrote that individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being. This means that the goal is not to add admirable qualities to your personality, but to gather back everything that was split off, denied, and discarded. Think of the ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna descending through 7 gates into the underworld, surrendering at each threshold a crown, a robe, a scepter, everything that identified her as powerful and whole, until she arrived at the bottom stripped of all she had defended. That is the grammar of individuation, not accumulation, but honest, terrifying return. And what does it mean to gather back something you spent a lifetime learning to disown, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a felt, embodied return? The most revealing movement is still ahead. Stay with us as we descend into how the shadow escapes its confinement and what it uses the faces of strangers to say. What if the people who provoke you most intensely are not obstacles to your peace, but messengers from the part of yourself you have most thoroughly abandoned? There is a strange alchemy that happens the moment the shadow finds it cannot stay inside. It turns outward, and suddenly the world becomes a theater for everything you have refused to know about yourself. The person who irritates you beyond all proportion, whose confidence reads as arrogance, whose ease you find offensive without quite being able to say why. That disproportionate charge is the shadow speaking in the only language available to it, the language of other people's faces. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This means the emotional heat you feel towards someone else is often a compass needle, pointing not outward but inward, toward the part of yourself you have most thoroughly disowned. And this works not only through contempt but through inexplicable attraction, through the quality you find magnetically compelling in a stranger, which is frequently the vitality you stopped allowing in yourself long ago. How often does your irritation feel too large for its occasion? And when it does, what might that excess be quietly protecting? And what if the very quality you find most repulsive in another person is simply a version of something alive in you that was never given permission to exist? The most quietly subversive truth is still ahead. Stay with us as we descend into what the shadow has been keeping, not the wounds you already know, but the vitality those wounds were protecting. Beneath the aggression, you were taught to suppress lives, the assertiveness that could have defended you without shame, the drive that could have carried real work into the world without apology. Beneath the sexuality that embarrassed your family, lives of vitality so fundamental that its absence has been quietly mistaken, for years, for tiredness. Beneath the ambition that was called selfish lives, a moral courage that knows what it actually stands for, rather than performing values borrowed from whoever was watching. Jung wrote that, "In every adult there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education." This means the shadow does not only hold what was broken, it holds what was never yet allowed to begin. What creativity have you quietly buried under the need to appear reasonable? What hunger have you learned to call a flaw? What would it feel like to stop apologizing for the size of your own hunger, to let it take up the space it was always meant to occupy? What if the version of yourself you were taught to be ashamed of is actually the version most capable of telling the truth? What you have encountered in projection and in the hidden gifts of the shadow is still only the surface of a much older question, the question of what it actually means to carry these rejected parts of yourself back into conscious life, and whether the ego that has spent decades building its careful image can survive that process without simply collapsing into a different kind of performance. The most unsettling truth is still to come. Stay with us as we descend into what integration actually asks of you and what it quietly costs. Here, then, is where the earlier promise returns, because recognition alone, as you may have already sensed, was never the destination, only the door. Jung wrote that shadow integration consists solely in an attitude, one of acceptance, informed attention, and long, difficult negotiation. This means that what the psyche asks of you is not a single heroic act of self-confrontation, but a sustained willingness to remain in conversation with what you have always refused to hear. Think of a painter who spent years working only in pale, careful tones, and then slowly, tentatively, begins reclaiming the darker pigments banished to the far edge of the palette. The canvas does not collapse into darkness when those tones are introduced. It deepens, acquires shadow and dimension, becomes capable of the full range of light. Without that darkness, every surface was flat, every scene bleached of the depth that makes it real. Integration is exactly this, not the surrender of the ego to the shadow, not the defeat of one by the other, but an effortful, ongoing dialogue in which both are changed. What does it cost, this kind of negotiation? And what inside you already quietly resists it, reaches instead for the safety of the earlier certainty? And what is on the other side of that resistance, not the version of yourself you imagine waiting there, but the version that was always there, beneath the negotiation, beneath the performance? There is a quality to people who have done this work, something you recognize before you can name it, the way you sense a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, subtle and certain at once. They do not perform their calm, they simply are calm in the way that a deep river is calm on its surface while enormous currents move beneath. The self-assurance you notice in them is not the brittle confidence of someone who has never been broken, but the earned steadiness of someone who has looked at the breaking and chosen to remain. This is what woken-up presence actually feels like from the inside, a lessening of the need to manage how others see you, a gradual release of the exhausting vigilance that once stood guard at the border of your self-image. Compassion becomes genuinely available, not the performed compassion of someone trying to appear kind, but the natural, unforced response of someone who has stopped being at war with their own interior. When you have met your own capacity for cruelty and did not flinch, the cruelty of others stops feeling like an accusation and starts feeling like recognition. You know what they are running from because you have seen the same thing in yourself, running at the same speed. And this brings us to the final revelation, the thing promised at the beginning that may be the most difficult to hear. What integration asks you to surrender is not your darkness, not your wounds, not even the carefully constructed identity you have spent a lifetime building. What it asks you to surrender is the fantasy that there was ever a version of yourself that was pure, undamaged, wholly good, the version you have been unconsciously measuring every real moment against since childhood. Integration does not ask you to become that person. It asks you to grieve the fact that you never were, and to discover that who you actually are, shadow and all, contradiction and all, is someone capable of a presence no performed self could ever sustain. That is woken-up presence, not the absence of darkness, but the refusal to pretend it isn't there, not the achievement of perfection, but the surrender of the need to appear perfect. And what, after all of this, is left of the person you thought you were? The person standing in that room full of people who trust them, the person you imagined at the beginning, is not someone who defeated their shadow. It is someone who stopped running from it, and in stopping, found that the energy once spent on running was now available for something else entirely. Being here, fully, without apology. Thanks for looking. Thanks.